All right. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for coming at 9 a.m. on a Saturday. This is wonderful to see such a full audience. Yeah, I guess we'll sort of get started today on the second day of the Tobias inaugural center or conference for the Center on Innovations and Development. We're going to start off today with a panel that I've called Local Livelihoods, the Environment and Development. So that really can encompass a whole lot. And so I want to sort of first say that this panel is really meant to think critically about development interventions, primarily for populations that rely on the environment for their livelihoods. So if I can maybe provide a brief anecdote that I think illustrates the kinds of problems that we'd like both our panel to talk about a little bit today, but also what we would like this cluster within the Tobias Center to think about moving forward. In West Africa, in southern Senegal, there is a low intensity sort of violent conflict that has been simmering for a while. And this has been going on for about 30 years, and it exists in this very rural portion of Senegal, where much of the population relies on farming and some forestry for livelihoods. And USAID has begun funding a project to develop sort of community institutions for how to manage these forests upon which so much of the population relies. And they've done this explicitly with the goal of building peace. So this idea that there is a link between sort of local livelihoods, development, and peace and stability. And this is a wonderful idea. And I learned about this and I said, that's so fascinating. And I have no idea what it is that we know as to whether that should work or not, right? So there's this really interesting nexus here whereby we had the international development community interested in this very local space and this particular effort to build peace without actually an academic understanding, without a research foundation as to whether that should work or not. And this is not to fault the international community, but to say that we need to communicate and coordinate more, right? That we might actually be able to design interventions that might actually be successful, that are built on research and that are built on partnerships to ensure that the interventions that we think are working or that we think should work are actually grounded in a sort of shared understanding as to what that might look like. I have to confess a little bit, that is, my own personal research interest, and so, but I do think that it helps to highlight the kinds of questions we'd like to focus on. I do want to sort of introduce our panelists here today. First, closest to me, we have Eduardo Brondizio. He's a professor in anthropology here at IU, and he has appointments in geography, SPIA, and actually several other centers on campus, including the Ostrom Workshop. For most of his career, he studied rural households in Amazonia to understand the effects of development programs and policies, social movements, environmental change, and commodity prices on their well-being. He is co-chair of the Global Assessment of Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services of the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystems Services, which is a very long title. And he has contributed to a variety of global assessments on forestry, food security, and ecosystems. To his left, we have Angela Musimbi Lusigi, and she is the policy advisor for UNDP's Regional Bureau on Africa. She's based in New York, and she's worked for UNDP on and off for about 10 years, and also has experience in the UN's environmental program based in Nairobi, Kenya. The UNDP Africa Bureau has over 1,200 development projects on the African continent, with over 1/3 of which focusing on sustainable development or environmental and climate adaptation. The UNDP partners with other implementing and donor organizations to improve progress, particularly on the sustainable development goals. So we welcome her all the way from New York. And then finally, we have John Eldon, who is an independent researcher and received his PhD in environmental studies from UC Santa Cruz, and will be a visiting scholar here, actually, at the Ostrom Workshop come the spring. And he spent the last 3 years or so working with farmers in West Africa, and before that in California and the Solomon Islands, to understand the drivers of farmer adaptation within managed ecosystems, with a particular focus on informing the decision makers of farmers, land managers, and other independent actors. He spent the last several years, particularly in Senegal and the Gambia, working in collaboration with local and international NGOs to design and manage nearly 1,000 farmer-led trials to evaluate strategies to improve crop production. He's also worked with development organizations such as the Alliance for Green Revolution, USAID, and Australia Aid. So I'm really hoping that our panel today can explore the unique challenges of identifying strategies for mitigating resource constraints in particularly rural contexts, and propose some strategies to address these challenges moving forward. I really think doing so requires new avenues of research informed by practitioner experience, policies informed by research, and opportunities for collaboration among these actors and the populations that these strategies are intended to affect. So we bring together academic and policy experience both in South America as well as Africa. And I'm really looking forward actually to hearing each of your reflections on how scholars and practitioners might work together to shape development intervention in this particular area for the future. So with that, I'm going to sort of begin with our panelists, and I really want to start actually in some ways at the sort of broad institutional level. And if I could start with you, Angela, my first sort of question that I'd love to hear your thoughts on is that the recent Africa Sustainable Development Report highlighted the lack of inclusiveness and sustainability of primary commodity-driven growth. And it reiterated the call for structural transformation anchored by commodity-based, commodities often come from particularly rural areas, commodity-based industrialization and accelerated reduction in inequality. I'm wondering if you can start us off, first of all, thinking about some areas of existing research or even additional research that you think might help advance this particular goal and the broader goals of UNDP's mission, either in Africa or elsewhere.
Okay, thank you. Wow, that's a really loaded question. But I'll refer to our Africa Sustainable Development Goal report because this is our first baseline study looking at where we are in Africa in relation to the Sustainable Development Goals, which were agreed in 2015. We haven't gone very far, but it's important to have a baseline. And then the added complexity we have is that we have the global goals, but we also have Africa-specific targets. We have an Agenda 2063, which was developed by the African Union. So in this report, we tried to come together and see how we could link the global targets with the Africa-specific targets and then position where we were. And there are three key takeaways from the report. The first area is around poverty and inequality. There has been some progress, but it's too slow. And as much as we're seeing a reduction in the poverty rates, the numbers are actually increasing because of population growth. So for us, this is a very critical area, and digging down, the reason why it's so slow is because of slow job growth. And also, we don't have the safety nets that are required so that even when people escape poverty, without those safety nets, they quickly fall back into poverty once we are hit by a shock or a crisis. So the first area definitely is how we can address this issue of the working poor, because we have people working, but they're not making enough to escape this poverty trap. And there's a particular emphasis on youth and women as well. So you need to drill down, disaggregate it, and really address where the problems are. So this is a critical area for us. The second area that was highlighted in the report is the rising food insecurity and malnourishment. On average, 1 in 5 Africans is malnourished. Of course, there's differences between countries. I mean, North Africa is doing very well. Other countries are not doing so well. But underlying this is the impact of conflict, as you mentioned. as well as extreme climate shocks, because it's all about governance. We do have droughts, we do have floods that affect many countries, but in areas where they are affected by conflict, that quickly turns into famine. So definitely we need to look at those linkages between how we can move forward on food insecurity and undernourishment. And then linked to commodities, we found that on the whole, most African countries are food importers. And on the other hand, they also depend on commodities, oil, primary agricultural products, and so forth. So when the global prices fall, they have less revenues and they're less able to import food. And this really targets the poor because they will be most hit by the price increases. So on one hand, we need to look at the conflicts and so forth, but we also need to look at how we can get these countries diversified away from primary commodities and more industrialized so that they are more revenue basis so that it can also fund other areas of development. And then the final area, which is very much resource related, is the agricultural value added. There has been very slow progress over time, and most of the responses we hear are more technocratic. Let's get more irrigation. But when we look at the local solutions, we definitely start looking at the impact of value chains and how we can integrate rural communities, peri-urban communities, younger people more into the agricultural value chain. And we have good examples, but we definitely need to see how we can scale them up so that we can use our resources sustainably.
Thank you very much. That's particularly helpful in sort of highlighting, the sort of broad range of different parts that sort of need to work together, and sort of the interdependence of them. And so I want to so thinking of that as in some ways very high-level institutional goals for a broad continent, I want to sort of zoom in now and actually ask John a question about sort of actually being on the ground and trying to think about what we can learn on the ground and then scaling up. So in particular, I'm curious, given your experience on working with so many different kinds of actors on the ground, what do you think that particular researchers can learn from that time with respect to the development community, development project implementation, and in particular, how did your understanding of the process of aid delivery in the context particularly of agricultural work change over your time working with these groups on the ground?
Well, I'll use the example of my work in West Africa, and I had an opportunity to go over there, had about a year to prepare, and I did what I've been trained to do as a scientist, read all the literature I could find, figured out what the current conversations were, what they weren't, what people were talking about, and by the time I got there, I had a plan, I had proposals in the works, I had everything set up, and I was lucky enough to be put in touch with a local NGO that I was going to partner with, and then a field officer that had 20, 30 years experience working in the Gambia. And sat him down, I said, okay, Dan, here's my plan, I got it. I got all the literature, citations, and everything I need, and he just laughed at me. Just completely said, oh yeah, sure, whatever. I said, no, you don't know the literature. I know, I can cite all of this. And he's just like, look, don't argue with me. We'll go talk to the farmers. And so we spent a month going around and just talking to farmers. 2 weeks in, I sat him down. I said, Dan, my ideas were stupid. I'm sorry. Like, what can we do? Like, I'm an ecologist. I'm a scientist. I can maybe get some grant money. I don't even know where to start anymore. And my year of preparation and all of my years of preparation before that, it's not that they were necessarily an implement, but they weren't necessarily a foundation. It sounds wrong. They were a foundation, but they weren't I'm not an expert. I can't come in, I can't parachute in and identify the problem and work on a technical solution for it the way I've been trained to do. And that's happened repeatedly in all the systems I've worked in. Someone has laughed me off and been like, I'll show you what I'm talking about. And then soon enough, I'm asking them what to do and how do we do this. And to the point now where I don't even pretend to do that. I'll do my background research, but I'm not going to go in with an answer in my pocket I can pull out at a moment's notice. So as far as the impact, I mean, I just can't imagine trying to do, and I work in soil science and agricultural adaptations, I can't imagine trying to do it from 30,000 feet, as they say. It's inconceivable to me that you could effectively do that. Some questions maybe, but yeah, it's just an absolutely essential part to kind of embed yourself in the system you're working in. Eduardo, you've been working in your system a lot longer than I have in mine. I'm sure there's probably not a point where you break through and you say, oh, now I understand how everything is, you know. The second part was...
Oh, it's just what you've sort of learned, but it sounds like you've sort of, I think you captured that.
Okay.
And I actually want to come back to this question of context that you focused on a little bit later in our discussion about the sort of importance of the way in which, not only do things change on the ground while you're there, but things change across space. And so being on the ground is particularly important in shaping these lessons. And I think the combination of those two approaches leads me actually perfectly to my third question for Eduardo here. And that is, you have said in your work that you speak of this sort of concept called a grounded complex systems perspective. And I know that also this is a little bit of the way in which I think John also thinks about the world. And so I'm wondering if you can say a little bit more about that and what that sort of implies for both researchers and also development workers on the ground working potentially with some of the more vulnerable populations to things like shocks and global and prices for global commodities as well as climate change.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here, first of all. It's Saturday morning. And thank you for the opportunity. I think this is a great initiative, so congratulations to the school open this kind of forum for us. So I think your question actually helps to link the two levels that you asked there, right? And I'll speak in the context of the Amazon. So imagine a region that in the past 40, 50 years encapsulates the kinds of changes that we see in the world, which means a very fast, accelerated region of change. So you look at the increase of rural populations because of migration, and it has been very fast. You look at infrastructural development, has been even faster. You look at the process of urbanization, right? The region has triple, quadruple in terms of urbanization. All of that happening at the same time. So when you look at and work with the rural population, you cannot work without the context of regional change, right? Now, how are we as scientists approaching those issues? So I work on the ground. I work with households a lot of the time. So that's one angle that you see those changes happening, and you try to understand from the perspectives of the household, how are they responding, right? What are their constraints? How are they making decisions and so forth? At the other level, I work at the regional level as well, looking at aggregated data, spatial change, transformation. And from there, you see a number of structural conditions that are shaping the direction of change of the region. Now, neither of those two levels are sufficient, right? And if we approach from one level, you find some kinds of problems and potential ways of approaching it. If you approach from the upper level, you find some explanation for the change, where it may be going, right? And some areas where you can focus on. But the issue is that one level is the product of the other, right? The structural conditions are shaping how those opportunities spread, those constraints limit people to benefit from what they do. And the local decisions, which are very heterogeneous, they shape how those changes appear in the landscape. And that's what I mean by a grounded complex system perspective, which is we need to break those disciplinary divisions that have put us in a level-specific point of view and try to understand how those interactions create change, right? And what changes are common to the region as a whole, and what changes emerge from the particularities of different places. So that's the approach that I bring, and I think that sort of helps to link with many of the constraints that Angela was talking about. They're exactly the same constraints that we see in the Amazon. There's exactly the same contradictions that we see. And I think it's that ability of linking and navigating between levels that help us to have an understanding of that complexity.
Okay, thank you. So I want to I want to take this, what we've had, this sort of brief abstract discussion of sort of linking levels of intervention and thinking about how what we do at the institutional level filters down, and how what we learn on the ground, how we might try to have that filter up and become really concrete. And that is, what I would like to know is, can you think of, or can you, if you can't think of an existing one, can you imagine a particular intervention in development, either a project or an effort in the area of livelihoods or the environment more broadly related to improving well-being, that you think was successful, and why you think so? What were the characteristics about it? So either a project, either that you came across in your work, or a partnership even, that you thought was successful. I do think so much time is spent, often it's easy to become a little bit, I wouldn't say pessimistic, but I tell my students to have a bit of healthy skepticism about the world. And I think that happens sometimes with aid and development efforts. And so I'd like to see if we can think of a particular project or idea or effort that has been successful, given your background and experience. So whoever wants to start with that one.
I think I can talk about, there's an initiative that's a poverty and environment initiative. That's a partnership between UNDP, the development program, and the environment program. And one of the critical things we were looking at the time was that for a long time we've talked about environmental sustainability, but we haven't seen that change in either policies and budgets and so forth. So one of the gaps that we found was that we lacked integrated evidence which could inform policymakers and speak the language that they understood. So I'll give you an example of a soil assessment study that was done in Malawi. I believe this was completed a few years ago. At the same time, they also looked at what was the gender gap in agricultural productivity in Malawi. And this was a very local intervention where they went to the communities and they tried to find out about the baselines when it comes to soil erosion, why it was happening, what was the economic impact of it. And they came up with some very interesting conclusions. And then the way they packaged it really appealed to policymakers. So, for example, they measured the level of soil erosion, but they also understood why the deforestation was happening is because the communities were relying on wood fuel, but they're also using it as an income opportunity. So they were getting some funds for that. So the study took the very physical elements of it and translated it into economic costs. So by the time they finished and they had a report, they went to the Minister of Finance and said, do you know you're losing 5% of your GDP because of this soil erosion? So they translated an environmental issue, soil erosion and deforestation, into a livelihood issue. We have low yields. The gap in women and male farmers also exacerbates this gap in productivity. You have a reliance on biomass, which has health consequences because of indoor air pollution. And then they even linked it to landslides, because now we're looking at risks. And once you have landslides, that also affects your yields and your ability to respond and come back from crisis. So I'm just giving this as an example of a very local intervention that worked with the specific communities, learned from their experiences, understood what was behind what was happening, and then translated this into an economic cost that actually, made sense to the policymakers. But what I like very much also about this study is that it broke the institutional silos. So it appealed to the Environment Ministry, which was interested in having a baseline, but then it also informed the Agricultural Ministry. So they actually started looking at the agricultural policy and revised bits of it to take into account how they could promote more climate-smart agriculture. So this is a very recent policy change, so we're hoping that will translate into budget considerations, but it also gives us a good basis for monitoring policy.
Wonderful. Anyone else?
Well, I'll be cynical here, because we've been working for 30 years in the Amazon, and I have a hard time thinking about successful development projects, and I have looked at hundreds, and they're mostly failed as a whole. So what can we learn from that, I think? So what I can say is that there are aspects of development projects and interventions that can be successful, right? As a whole, in that region, and based on my experience, in general, they have failed. And why they have failed, I think, is an important way of understanding the parts that were successful. Most of them, they have failed because they're interventions, right? And intervention is, the problem is framed outside. And that's where you start from the beginning to fail a project, right? You're defining the problem away from the problem. So that's one issue. They are subsidy-based. And subsidy lasts as long as subsidy lasts, right? So when you come with intervention, you come with subsidy, you are doomed to fail right after the subsidy goes away, right? They tend not to address structural constraints, right, which facilitates people to make their own decisions and so forth. And a lot of the time, they're technocratic, so they don't deal with the fundamental human capital issues that are in the problem. So those are conditions that we see across projects that lead them to invest millions of dollars, sometimes in a handful of households, and it still create more problems than they had before. Now, what aspects can be successful? I think the learning process, when human capital is involved, people carry that much farther than the life of a project, right? So I think there are many successful examples of that people learn to deal with external agents, learn to have a political voice, learn to organize themselves in a particular way, and that then has very positive implications going forward. So that's one example that I can think of projects that have a longer life. The other elements is when you really try to bridge a particularly market constraints that put people in an unfavorable conditions, even though they may have the most valuable resource, right? But they cannot take advantage of that because of market constraints. So projects that create and bridge that gap, either lowering the cost of transportation or lowering the cost of production, facilitating a higher value aggregation, those projects, and then let people making their decisions and according to their goals, those projects tend to have more success, right? Because they bridge that disadvantage that rural populations tend to have in relation to the markets that they work. So those are some elements that I'll put on the table.
Well, I'd love to pass on this question. I think I worked in the industry enough to see how reports are made to be very skeptical of anybody else's report or my own. Just the process and the incentives, and it makes me very, very skeptical of projects that I wasn't actually on the ground able to see them implemented. So among the ones I was on the ground able to see them implemented, there's one that I thought was surprisingly successful and really quite fun, involving the conflict region in southern Senegal. And so going back to the story I just mentioned of me and this field officer running around Gambia and me saying, Dan, what do we do? What we came up with is was really a paradigm shift in my thinking about research and about these issues. And it's like, I don't need to tell the farmers what to do at all. They are perfectly capable of making their own decisions. They don't have time to do experiments, I do. So let's do experiments. They'll interpret it their way, I'll interpret it my way. At no point do I need to tell them what's best for them. They're perfectly capable of that, and they know a lot more about their situation than I do. So we started doing just field trials. So we would go in and we would go to the farmer, we'd say, here's 18 different things that maybe you haven't tried. We'll basically, and this involves new crop varieties, organic materials, and organic fertilizers, things they hear about but maybe don't have the availability, or it's too expensive, whatever. For whatever reason, they can't maybe try it. So we would go in and say, look, we'll basically pay you and supply everything and set up this trial. You take from it what you will. so we started doing that approach, and we had a small grant that we received kind of, not unexpectedly, but we received more grants than we expected to and had a capacity problem. So we had this small grant to work on farmer adaptation in this conflict zone, where to even go there, you're supposed to have an escort and everything. I didn't always, but it's not a real easy place to work. A lot of the roads are shut down, there's some rebel blockades, there's mines. So what we ended up doing was basically taking this guy I'd worked with, this field officer, and we developed this idea of working with some kind of key communities, and in each community trying to get, I think it was up to 100 farmers in the area, doing some really simple trials. And I was busy off in other parts of the country with larger grants and didn't have a lot of time for this. And I was like, Dan, we got your new motorcycle, go at it, you know. Let me know what you need. I'll send seed, I'll send materials, I'll wire the money, whatever. And he basically disappeared into the bush for 4 months. And I would try to keep up, you know, with what was going on as we could, but it was very little oversight because we couldn't. And it was hard to get any sort of numbers. We tried surveying, we tried doing things, and we just didn't have the capacity. But the whole time he was in there, and like 600 farmers set up these simple trials, and we had a real simple model of just, you know, put a strip of manure in your field, plant a new crop variety that we supplied, and this is in areas that hadn't, you know, they had to walk 20 miles to get to market. There was no transportation. A lot of the seed quality was very low, and so we were able to get it in there. And then it was like, hey, try it, and if you like it, great. If not, fine. You know, paid them whatever it was for their time and troubles. The next year, I went back into there. So we did the best we could to try to gather how successful it was. We had some meetings. It was hard to report on. The next year, I went in there to do some more trials at more kind of a formal level, and I had trouble getting manure. Like, we would pay farmers to get manure, and they'd say, ooh, that's not enough. And previously, it was getting burned, it was getting thrown in the ditches, it wasn't identified as a valuable input. And it was like, what do you mean we can't get manure? Like, there's cows all over the place. And they're like, oh, I already used it. Or, I'm saving it for my garden. Or, it's more valuable than what you're offering. And I think it was largely due to this one guy's work and his ability to work with communities and avoid the top-down prescriptive approach, and instead say, hey, I'm here to help you try something new. If you like it, great. But it was such a shock to go back into this region, because I'd been there before, and not be able to secure manure for our trials. And it was like, there are more cows here than, it's like, how is this possible? And I was like, I think I know what happened, is that approach was successful enough on the ground. The report wasn't great. We didn't have the numbers we would have liked, the survey we would have liked. But the effect on the ground was successful enough where I couldn't get manure, which,
It's a good indicator.
yeah, for a soil scientist, that's a big thing, so, you know.
Okay, so I want to build on these sort of shared stories and experiences. And one of the things that, you know, I think a repeated theme so far in this conference is trying to think about how we generalize really specific contexts, right? We've got a particular region that has limited access to inputs. We've got a region that has particular soil erosion. We've got another region that has experienced a variety of different kinds of interventions and maybe has lost a little faith in them. And one of the things that I'm interested in thinking about and having you guys maybe reflect on a little bit is, given the wide variance in context, given the mass differences between each of these regions, between each of these communities, what are the kinds of generalizable lessons that you think that both researchers and policymakers might take in moving forward? So this is actually a fundamental problem we have in research often, right, is the trade-off between having a really, really, really good understanding of a particular place and a particular point in time, right, and then trying to say something about the broader world. And so I'm asking you guys to solve that problem for us. No, I'm just kidding. So I'm asking you to reflect a little bit on whether there are things that you think are generalizable in spite of, or maybe even given the vast variance and sort of local context that each one of you have worked in?
Okay.
We're all looking at you.
It's such an easy question, I don't know.
What's generalizable? I think what we're talking about is generalizable in the sense that what we have learned about development is that if you start to frame the problem from the ground up, right? I mean, that's generalizable. I think if we go that in many places, you have a better chance of succeed. But what I think is generalizable is that in many populations, in those regions, in regions where we work, they suffer similar structural constraints. So I think we need to be appreciative that when you generalize issues, you need to understand that there are structural issues that can affect larger populations. And that interact differently with their then property systems, their community organization, their conflicts, environmental endowment, and so forth. So I think really as you work in a particular area to be aware of how that area is part of a larger system and influenced by price dynamics, market dynamics, infrastructural access and conditions, I think helps you to tailor projects in a way that is sensitive to both those more general constraints and local needs.
Okay. I'm an analyst, so I have a hammer and everything will look like a nail. And I believe in the power of integrated evidence. And just looking at the issues about local livelihoods, environment, and development, I feel that we need to move away from having a single lens on particular problems. And like Eduardo said, that the problem is now defined for us. So when we approach a particular problem, whether you're looking at soil erosion or you're looking at, gender gaps, gender inequality, you have to try and get the integrated evidence that looks at the economic, the social, and environmental impacts and bring it together. Because when you do that, then you're able to work and break institutional silos. So you're no longer just talking to the environmental camp or the, economic camp or the social camp, but you're bringing them together to have integrated solutions, integrated policies, integrated budgets, and the way you monitor these things. And then I also think that also coming from what John said, it's about empowering different stakeholders. So you're not only talking to the policymakers, but you're also talking to, in the local context, we now have local leaders, local government. You have local businesses. And all of these have to become part of the solution because for the example that John gave about, providing the seeds and so forth, that's where private sector and local businesses can come in. So you don't always have to be looking to have these solutions to come from the center, or to come from outside or so forth, but you can integrate these stakeholders into the resolving problems. And then also, I think yesterday we talked a lot about financing. And at least in the African context, we know that a lot of the resources that we're going to need to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals will have to be domestic, and they will have to come from the private sector. So we're moving away from having overseas assistance to looking at how we can mobilize more domestic resources and so forth. But unless you have the integrated evidence to build the case, to invite these stakeholders on board, then you will not be able to make progress.
I really appreciate the ideas that came from both about integrating different perspectives and having more of a complex system approach. I'd love to hear more about that if we can. Rather than you say that it was a hammer nail thing, but it didn't sound like, maybe you had a big hammer, I don't know. And in agriculture, I've often seen people that do have a very, very small hammer and nail, and I have a technical fix, I don't care what your problem is, I have the answer already. And I think that really doesn't scale well at all, and this is going to agriculture. There's a tendency to say, we know what's best, we already found it, we did the research over here, it's best for you too, we know. And this kind of very reductionist approach, and it just doesn't work. And I think the idea of scaling practices, very specific practices, such as certain rates of inorganic fertilizer, certain mechanization, it really doesn't work very well. I think there are approaches that can scale really well. I think from the research side, the more integrated assessments, I think that can be done anywhere. It's a really valuable tool. My own work, I think our farmer field trial approach works really well. But again, it works well because we aren't saying specifically what's going to work well, but it's here's a means of kind of empowering adaptation. It's not, we aren't going to tell you what that adaptation looks like. So yeah, I think there's a big problem with trying to scale the specifics or the technical things. And my background in ecology, think about adaptation. It's like, well, what works in one place very likely will not work in another place, but they might be going in the same direction as a result. And so, one farmer might adapt, might move forward and improve their situation through access to financial credit. Another one might be through access to better seed. Somebody else might get a donkey. They're all kind of moving in the same direction, and there's ways to encourage that movement without saying everybody gets a donkey.
Anybody else want to add? Because I want to pick up on the scaling question, right? Actually, I think, John, you actually touch on something that another development scholar has also brought up. Owen Barter has mentioned the sort of problem of scaling up and how we should think about this, right? And this is maybe another framing of the generalizability question, but it's even more about the sort of institutional scaling up. And so one of the things that I think is particularly valuable is to have this knowledge and this understanding that time and space varies, and therefore, right, not every hammer works everywhere, right? But knowing that, right, is helpful, but that's an expensive predicament to be in, right? That is an incredibly resource consuming predicament because it requires that you study every problem uniquely and you intervene or you think about it or you develop partnerships uniquely. And so I'm thinking about whether folks have other reflections about the idea of scaling up. How do we think about scaling up? This is sort of like lessons, generalizable lessons, but it's a more sort of formal institutional question about building in mechanisms to do the sorts of things that each one of you have sort of talked about and need to be done. So I guess the framing of that as a question is, what are the kinds of aspects of sort of incentives for both researchers and policymakers that might create that kind of learning and that kind of feedback between the local context and these institutional scaling up problems?
We approach it this particular way. I think a lot of the interventions, both external or governmental, are place-based many times, and they're group-based, right? So, from the Amazon, you see that very much. You have interventions that are targeted to different social groups, that are targeted to different areas, and develop institutions for those particular conditions. What we cannot escape today is the connectivity of all those systems. Everything is connected, right? But not the institutions. So one of the biggest gaps that we have in this area, and I'm talking about rural agrarian issues and conservation, environmental issues that I work with, are bridging institutions. Institutions that bridge different groups, different locations, and create that a space for discussion of problems that are common, right? So a typical problem, for instance, is the environment and watersheds are parceled in different kinds of interventions, but they're interconnected, right? So problems that happen in one place will have reflected in another place, even though they may have very different governance systems. So I think in terms of scaling up, what we have not invested as much is on those bridging institutions. Institutions in which people that have different goals, agendas, and histories are able to talk or able to think about the problems that they have in common. And I think that would go a long way in linking success stories at the local level to the larger environment in which they are embedded, right? It's from the Amazonian perspective, this is very sort of very much the need that we see now. Why? You have created an enormous amount of conservation areas, indigenous areas, large-scale agricultural development, all of that around a very large urban network. But each one is work as a separate institution, right? So you have now indigenous populations or small communities or rural communities confronting the farmers that are polluting the area, above, or being confronted by others who are suffering from their pollution. But there hasn't been much effort to think about institutions that bridge those different systems. So I think in terms of scaling up, I think we need to think more in terms of the connections between different areas and different populations.
Jessica, I think to answer your question, we have to go back to what we said at the beginning, that the local context is changing rapidly. So we no longer have that very clear divide between rural and urban. By 2015, 1 in 2 Africans will be living in an urban area. So as we think about these changing contexts and being able to address these challenges, we also have to look at the changing levels of governance. We used to have very centralized systems where we had one ministry, taking care of everything that happens in a different region, and there was a cookie-cutter approach. Now we're having more decentralized systems. So we're having local governments having more authority and trying to define solutions that are relevant to that context. So as far as I can tell, if you're looking at issues around scalability and really bringing together the environment and local livelihoods agenda, then we need to be looking at those institutions at those decentralized levels. Because right now in many countries, they're not really equipped to be able to take on board some of these objectives, and especially as we're coming along with 17 sustainable development goals and so forth, we really want to be able to capacitate these local institutions to be able to take on board all the different areas that they have to take on board when they're planning their budgets.
Once again, I'm afraid I don't have much of an answer to that question. I love that we're asking the question scaling up, because some of the donors and organizations I worked with in Africa were still trying to figure out how to scale down. We have the answer. How do we make everybody learn the answer? So the fact that we're asking this more inductive question of, we've got evidence of adaptation, we've got innovation happening on this, what can we learn, how do we move up with that, is great. It's I think really a step forward. One of the things that we struggled with, and again, this is, I have to speak from experience because my background's not in policy and in intervention so much, is as the institutions change, the incentives change with them. And so at a certain level, we'd work with like a seed cooperative. They know everybody by name. They're working within a certain region. They've got, thousands or tens of thousands of farmers working with them. But they've got they can scale up within that through different mechanisms than once you move past that level and you get into national or international institutions. And at least what I saw in the NGO world is that the incentives were not at all where they needed to be. And people talked about this yesterday, about how if you have a 1-year project and you need to get a PhD out of it, or a 3-year project in my case, I'm not really that interested in the 4th year. I don't have a lot of incentive for that continuity. And I cared about it and I tried, but that's not part of it. And you have high turnover in a lot of these international organizations. And I think that really changes the ability of like institutional learning, where you don't have that continuity in leadership and everybody's looking for a way to get back to Geneva or something like that. And that a lot of learning that is coming up to that level, I think then stops, because there's just different levels of incentive and different mechanisms, and it's hard to get it past that. I know within the organization I worked in, there was a fields team and there was the office team, and there wasn't a lot of interaction between them. And that was within one relatively small organization. When I looked at the bigger ones, it would seem to be the same sort of thing. There's like the city office and the regional office, and things go this way, they don't go that way. But I love that we're asking the question,
Yeah.
how do we get past that?
I think just to jump on that, there are a lot of experiences that are happening, but we just don't have the information and people are not able to access the learning. So I think one of the ways that we can look at it is also how can we harness the power of technology and so forth to make those connections between all the learning that is happening already and also to get people working together across disciplines and generating that information that can be used by somebody else. I mean, you might stop somewhere and then somebody can use what you have generated to continue. But I find that there are a lot of, when you're trying to do research on issues around agricultural productivity and so forth on the continent, there's a lot happening, but you just can't get your hands on the latest information and what people are doing.
Yeah, I mean, this does continue to present a problem, both because we're talking about, by definition, in some ways, regions with often limited access to technology, et cetera, where we're also suggesting that maybe some of the most important kinds of lessons are based on innovation and agency, which means that those responses are going to vary a lot, and that information is going to be all the more important to have. I want to turn a little bit in a different direction for a moment, because we've talked a bit about scaling up institutions, context, and part of our discussion here, I think, in some ways has to talk a little bit about whether we see and how and to what extent we see the project of development as either in parallel with or necessarily potentially at odds with aspects of sustainability, environmental sustainability. So in other words, oftentimes we talk about the concept of double wins. Can we both improve livelihoods, improve access to public goods, improve well-being, while also ensuring that there's some degree of environmental concern, environmental conservation at the same time, right? What are kinds of, when that's not happening, what are interventions that might facilitate it? And if it is, what are things that we can take away and understand from that? So I want to sort of ask you a little bit about under what conditions do you think double wins are possible? In other words, that you can see improvements in livelihood while either both improving or at least conserving the local environment, and when you think those things might be at odds, given your experience.
So we're looking at you.
I'll go ahead and we can go.
All right, so start that way.
I feel bad making I get to clean up, but the double win or win-win is, as I've seen it, it's a great concept, and I've often been really frustrated how it's been used, because I'll see somebody study the win they're interested in, assume the other win, and then claim both. And so they'll measure the environmental impact and not really measure the economic impact or the social implications, but then make like a kind of deductive claim about soil quality, therefore crop yield, therefore food security. Oh, triple win, And it's really I'm often frustrated when I hear that term, not because it's a bad term. I think it's a great idea. It's just difficult. In my own field, I think like production efficiencies can really be an example of that. So I went in as an ecologist interested in the more environmental sustainability questions. I would then go to the farmers and say, look, whether you want to produce more or work less and produce the same, that's up to you, but this is entirely an economic situation. This is in your self-interest. I'm not going to get into carbon sequestration. I'm not going to get into soil health or any of that. But, with better soil management, you can produce less on produce more on the same field, or do so with less input. And for them, that's strictly an economic question. And I think a lot of scientists, a lot of natural scientists in particular, could really do a better job of making that bridge instead of assuming that the bridge will just kind of make itself. Worth noting, a lot of the guys I'd work with in in Senegal and Gambia, they would use the term sustainable not to talk about environmental sustainability or sustainable development, but they would say a project was unsustainable if it couldn't stand on its own feet after the money was gone. And so they would see a proposal and they'd say, or they'd see a project being implemented and they'd say that is totally unsustainable because as soon as that money's gone, it's going to be a rusted signboard and that's it. Which I thought was a really interesting way to think about sustainability.
Okay, before I come to a specific response to that, I just wanted to double back to what do we mean by development. And a lot of times when people talk about development, they're talking about the income side of it, the economic side of it. And one of the definitions I really love is what we use at UNDP as a definition of human development, which is the process of expanding people's choices and opportunities to live the lives that they would like to live. So we have this Human Development Index, which looks at the core, what are the core dimensions that you need to live the kind of life that you want, it's education, to be knowledgeable, to be healthy, and also to have access to resources. But something that is also silent under that is to be able to live the kind of life that you want to live, you need a voice in the decisions that affect your life. And you also have to be, have access to a healthy environment. And then you also have to see the intergenerational impacts. And that's why we think about environmental sustainability, because you have to be able to live the life that you want now without infringing on future benefits. Now, specifically to that question, I also have the concern about the win-win, because I remember very clearly working with the government of Tanzania at one point, and they were trying to protect the environment. There's a wetland area, and there was trouble with pastoralists coming to destroy the area, and they decided to fence it off and keep them out because they wanted to protect the river and so forth. Then it gets tricky because you also have to think of the livelihoods of the pastoralists. I mean, there has to be a way where you can balance their use of the available resources because they need it for their livelihoods, while also protecting downstream, who happen to be the rich rice farmers. So again, the issue that you talked about, it's about power. So who's more powerful? So they win downstream, and what happens to the pastoralists who don't have power? So again, it becomes a very tricky situation where definitely you want to look at the long term, but you also have to look at the existing livelihoods, and those who don't have the power might actually get stiffed. Yeah.
That's really well said, I think. I'll stop there. But I'll take an issue with the question itself. I have a problem personally of understanding this idea of double win or win-win and so forth. I think this is part of an old paradigm of development where it's a sectoral paradigm. And therefore, when you talk about win-win or not, you're talking about competing sectors of development. So it's a reflection of the old thinking of development, I think, because the point is that there's trade-offs to everything. And it's talking about trade-offs. And what are the social choices that people make in thinking about those trade-offs that matters to me? So, yeah, I mean, you can have win-win depending on the very specific things, but I think it's a frame that is about sectors. What has, and that carries to today, and I think that's the problem, that we still have that kind of frame of approaching the environmental sector, approaching the educational sector, approaching the health sector in ways that are separate. And with that, we're not asking the tough questions, right? So, you look, and I think there were great examples here. You look at the transformation of areas in Africa, in the Amazon, in Asia, right? People there are confronting very fast rate of change, incredibly fast urban growth, high levels of violence, a number of structural conditions that need to ask different questions. I think they pose different questions. And what we see today is that you have enormous investment on climate change mitigation, for instance. That's one area. And that becomes the sector of investment that disregards the social conditions that people are living on the ground. So you can promote a high degree of carbon compensation, but if you look at the the implications of that, it may be affecting many other sectors. So I think we need to move beyond that sector approach that frames issues of win and losers, and ask different questions about the interactions between the urban problems, the social problems, the climate problems, and how they're playing out. So I think we need to ask different questions in terms of development.
I think that's a really good point about getting away from the idea of competing interests and win-losses, and instead talking about shifts in the system and the trade-offs associated with that shift. As one colleague pointed out once, he said it shouldn't be win-win, it should just be win. And just this idea that there are, again, this competing interests that are at odds with each other, I think is detrimental and can hold the conversation back. One addition I wanted to make to that, nope, don't remember what it was.
Darn it, that was my time to think of another question.
Yeah.
Some of the themes that we've sort of touched on, just to maybe summarize before we start going to the audience. So far, what I've heard is a lot about thinking more about the interconnectedness of problems, both in terms of the nature of the sector, but also in terms of the level at which we approach them. So trying to take, and this I think is embodied very well in the notion of integrated evidence, right? So we've talked a lot of, I've heard a lot of references to sort of thinking more holistically about the sort of interconnectedness of the system in which we're working. I've also heard a lot about the importance of agency, right? Of understanding, for instance, how maybe donors or project implementers might think of their roles slightly differently, in that you have farmers who have been doing farming for many, many years, right? And can make their own decisions about how to improve their yields based on having more resources or access to more resources or fewer constraints, right? And then also I've heard a lot about thinking about how we can align incentives with some of these interventions, right? So how do we sort of frame these issues in ways that are both effective at galvanizing interest, but actually at making governments change their budgets, right? About thinking differently about these things. So I want to ask one last final question, which is really a selfish question, if I can. And that is, from each one of your perspectives, if you had to say one thing that you thought the sort of, maybe the researchers that are coming together through the Tobias Center could do or contribute to both this conversation or the body of research about development and the environment and livelihoods, what would it be?
Oh, dear.
I sprung this one on you guys, I'm sorry. We could turn, if you'd like some time, we could turn to the audience and come back to it to end. Let's do that. Unless did you want to add?
Well, I can.
Yeah, go for it.
And this is less about the Tobias Center in particular, but one of, I think, the bigger problems that I see with the way research is done is the level of hubris that's associated with it. And just getting, I was trained that, since I'm trained, then I must be trained. It just perpetuates this idea that I must have a solution. I don't understand your question, but you're asking me for an answer, so I'll give you one. And this idea that I can make the citations and Dan on the motorbike can't, and therefore information is going this way. And I don't know how an institution like the Tobias Center in particular could respond to that. But I think that's just a really critical problem as far as how research is done, how it can influence development, and getting away from the kind of technical solution and getting away from the need to have all the answers or the need to be right all the time or hide that evidence that doesn't fit my theory. It's so ingrained through all the sciences and I think development industry as well. So yeah, that's less of an answer of what the Tobias Center might do and more of another problem that maybe we can put on the list.
So I'll give I think what we can do is starts at home, right? Starts here. And that means, open up a conversation across departments, across schools, across, sectors to learn from each other more. How can we frame problems differently? So in the context of the center, for instance, it's making a center that is not a school-specific center, right? It's a center that leverage on the expertise that is across campus and bring people to talk and to bridge the disciplinary gaps, the jargon, the language, those things in the institutional structure that separates the schools, departments, people in ways more than we imagine. So I'd say we start here. That's one thing that we can do, is having that conversation, have space for that conversation, respect different perspectives from the humanities, to the hard science. I think that will go a long way. So that's one thing that we can do. The other thing is, thinking about approaches and methodologies where in the field we have more participatory approaches, and we have ways in which we have mechanisms in which you can talk with farmers, with large farmers and small farmers, city planners, local social leaders, and whoever. But having those methodologies in which we create that space to understand problems better, to understand how people frame, what evidence are important, what indicators are important. So I think that's one thing that we can do, is contribute starting from our own spaces of work here.
I'd like to jump on that. Even as we're talking about interconnection between the different disciplines, I would like to see more reaching out to institutions that are already working in other countries, because the problem is being framed there. And then you can respond here with all the integrative thinking, so that you can actually create a web and a network that amplifies solutions, so that we're not always starting again from zero.
Wonderful, thank you. Okay, so let's turn to the audience. Last 20, 25 minutes or so. It looks like we have a lot of questions. I think I saw you had your hand up first, just here, just in front.
Hi, my name is Zeb Holtz, and I'm a sophomore here. So my question is, I'm really interested in technology and also international studies. So there's been a lot of technological leapfrogging that's been going on in many developing countries. So for example, they might not have had landline telecommunication networks, but now they have cell phones, or they might not have had public libraries, but now they're getting more access to the internet. So how do you think on the individual level that will affect their development, or community level too? Because these communities, it's just a huge leap. And you talked some about information problems and just the diffusion of information, but now they have that, they really do. So it's part of our responsibility, I feel, to manage how they interact with that in a positive way to make sure that it just doesn't get wasted, essentially, or not used efficiently.
I have some thoughts on that. I remember I was in college and I read a New York Times article about how ubiquitous cell phones are becoming in Africa, and I was like, yeah, right, sponsored by the cell phone industry or something, I thought. And I went there, and it's just incredible. Like, it is, and the scientists that I brought over during the time there, that was often the first thing they commented on, was like, wow, everybody has a cell phone, or at least access to one. And for the last 10 or 15 years, there's been talk about farmers with smartphones and all the things we can do, and a whole bunch of apps have gone out. Most of them have not been very successful. I've been part of projects that were not very successful involving farmers with phones. I think part of that, not to jump on you, but the idea of that it's up to us to manage how that works is problematic. I think it's working. There's things we can do to kind of develop channels, develop communication pathways or whatever. So again, not to jump on you for that. It's a really cool thing that's happening, and there's a lot of things that researchers can, or development workers, whoever, can do to kind of open up opportunities within that. I think we need to be very careful about how we do that. And I think part of the reason why a lot of these projects have not worked is that they take and here's what you'll do with your smartphone. It's like, no. Nobody, that doesn't work for anybody. It wouldn't work here, why would it work there? So that's just a thought as you move forward in this thing. Farmers are gonna start using cell phones in Africa, and it's gonna happen quickly, and it won't happen because of any project. They already are using their smartphones. I mean, it's incredible some of the things that are happening with that. as you move forward in this, just keep in mind, you're part of this, or you're trying to influence a bigger thing that's already changing. And it's not a directing it, it's a kind of assisting or just getting involved in some way. It's a really cool industry going on. It's a great time to be interested in that.
Okay, just a practical example. I think this is something that is already being harnessed, but they're homegrown solutions. So it's not coming from us saying this is how you should use it. We have digital entrepreneurs now who come up with apps for farmers in dairy for them to know, this, if the temperature is this, do that, do that, do that. And it's addressing a need that the farmers have. So that's why they're using it. And that's why they came up with it. So it's not something that's actually being promoted from outside, but it's something that's growing organically. And I've seen that happen in Kenya. There's applications also in the health sector as well, maternal, addressing maternal mortality and so forth. So it's happening.
I'll just make a comment. In the Amazon, what we've seen in the last 15, 20 years was an incredible transformation of access to communication, transportation change, energy change, and that has allowed people to make decisions that they couldn't done before, so communicate and understand market niches, being able to move between rural and urban areas in a much more expedited way, make choices that they didn't have. So it opened up a whole universe, I think, of decisions for people. Now, on the other hand, they are confronted with the old infrastructural technical problems that cannot resolve. So you have this very contradictory situation of people being able to access information and to act upon, but being constrained in an environment that, from sanitation, to other issues, constrain them too. So you have a very paradoxical situation in that way.
Well, if I can just add how all of your responses sort of really capture something that you said earlier, Angela, about thinking about development as choices, right? And I think some of my students here will have a little bell going off in their head about Amartya Sen's development as freedom, right? So I just wanted to sort of focus on particularly another way in which technology in some ways magnifies that. It doesn't guide the choices that people make, it just allows them more choices potentially, right? Is one way to think about it. Yeah, way back in the plaid, I think I saw your hand go up.
Hi, thank you for the discussion today. I've really enjoyed this session. I was here all day yesterday, but this one so far is my favorite.
Thank you.
Sorry.
We're keeping tabs on it.
My name is Tyler Abbott. I'm a second-year MPA student over in SPIA studying international development and nonprofit management. This question is mostly for Eduardo, but I think Angela and John can also provide some input on this. Just to give you a little background on where I'm coming from with this, in SPIA we have a program that goes to Uganda and conducts international development projects with NGOs on the ground. And we learn a lot about asset-based community development, and I think that is something that John learned a lot when he got on the ground in West Africa, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but so in this framework of development, we believe that there are many ways of viewing successes with development projects. And one thing that Eduardo said that kind of follows along those lines is that we should be having links with local success stories to the greater environment. So I'm wondering if you would agree with me that within the many approaches to development, there should be the same understanding that it's unhealthy to sort of mar a development project with the label of failure, because there are some successes within those failed projects. So I guess what I'm also wondering then is, can you see some alternative successes in those failed development projects? And how do you measure success on the broader scheme for those projects?
Oof,
I'm
okay.
very glad I'm not a
But
panelist right
very
now.
Good, very good question.
It's you.
I think we take little time to talk about the failures of projects, right? I think we live in many places the tyranny of pilot projects. We come and instead of talking of what we have learned and from previous experience, you start a new one or start a new idea. So yeah, maybe don't need to frame in terms of failures, but you need to recognize the shortcomings of projects over time and reflect on that. what I see also as an issue is that you have very, projects, there's very little cumulative or additive improvement that you see from project to project, right? So I think projects that approach conditions that will create opportunities for more people and that can be maintained over time tend to create, sort of to pave the way for them to be a source of a foundation for development. So that'll be my brief reflection.
It reminds me of very early in my career, I was an evaluator, and I went to see the outcome of a household and food security project in a rural part of Zambia. And I remember traveling around southern province, and one of the things that, and I was responsible for the rural water supply and gender. I was the only woman, so I had to do gender. But, so one of the things that we saw was that they were drilling boreholes, and then in order to manage the borehole, they had to create a village committee, and the idea was that they were going to grow vegetables and so forth and so forth. So we traveled from area to area, and I saw, in some cases, complete lack of, the borehole came, it was installed, it worked for some time, and then it, fell apart and nobody cared. They were like, oh, the people that came to put the borehole haven't come to fix it, right? And then in another community, you would find they had a village committee in place, they had the vegetables growing. When it fell, when it had problems, they would, they knew how to fix it. First, they were trained how to fix it, or they hired in somebody to come and fix it because they had, fees going on. So on the face of it, if I had only focused on the areas where it wasn't working, I would have said it was a failure. But there was learning to be had from being able to compare what was happening in the different areas and identifying the underlying factors that led to, success or failure. And one of the critical thing we found was that there were two different NGOs which were helping to implement the project. One NGO in the areas that was successful spent a lot of time sensitizing the community, talking to them, finding out what their real needs were, and really embedding it into the already existing structures. So they didn't come and develop a new village committee, or they built on something that was already existing and so forth. The other NGO that was responsible for the failed areas just came in, installed the thing, put the flag, this is it, you have a new borehole, that's it. So I think there's a lot of learning to be had. So I agree with you that failure is actually opportunities for learning, and we can actually begin to identify the different things that we need to capture in new projects.
And I'll just add a little bit more. I think you're right that it's not very productive to label a project as, success or failure and leave it at that. I do think most organizations are really good at putting a positive spin on it. So it's not like we're overly critical and no one is saying anything, They're real good at that. I really like what Angela said, and that it's good to think about, if something didn't work out the way it was intended, what can we then learn from it? And when we design experiments in science, we often say, design it in such a way that failure, or not getting the result you would expect, is interesting. So how can, and right there, Angela just pointed out, the fact that one organization was doing something different, dramatically different, and another one wasn't, suddenly it's not a question of our boreholes good, it's like a good project is boreholes plus this way of embedding them into the community. And that's a really important result. So you're right that it's not worth calling it a failure or success and just leaving it at that. If you're worried that we're being too critical on development projects, there's a lot of other people being maybe compensating for it.
Yeah, there's lots of questions.
Yeah, just right here.
Hi, hello, my name is Boštjan Skalar. An interesting discussion. Since I come from more institutional, we are also in touch with UNDP. And now the recent couple of sentences are about duplications, triplications, quadruplations. Even institutions, I would address the question to you. Because we have all these big guys in our consultative committee, World Bank, OECD, all UN agencies. I don't know how do you feel it, but even within UN, there are competition. So everyone tries to make different programs for the same, let's say, poor people in Africa? Why is it so? Why we don't come together, we join forces and we do something together, which is good for them? Thank you.
Well, actually you're speaking to the heart of what's going on now with the UN reform. And I think at the beginning, moving from the Millennium Development Goals to the Sustainable Development Goals, we needed a coherent framework that responded directly to the requests from the My World survey, where we had people speaking and saying this is exactly what we wanted, which is how we ended up with 17 Sustainable Development Goals. But this is now the framework that we have to come together and work around. And the Secretary General has been very clear about the fact that, you know, this institutional duplication is coming to an end. They're reformulating the way we respond at the global, at the regional, and at the country level. At the country level, we already had some reforms with the One UN framework, which is still gathering pace. But the idea is that let's focus on the national development objectives, and let's see how, as the UN family, we can respond to those development objectives. So at the country level, we are very much far ahead because we have one UN development assistance framework. So it's very clearly outlined. This is what each agency is going to do to support the national development objectives. Now, at the regional and global level, of course, this is still work in progress because it's also linked to funding. You know, so, I mean, you definitely want to show that you have a stake in a certain area so that you can, you know, attract the necessary funding. So there's a perverse incentive to try and do as much as possible so that you can get, you know, as much funding. But if we get the same understanding from the funders and the, you know, the institutions, I think we can make a lot of progress, but this is definitely something that's already taking place.
Just here, yeah. Yep, you, Nazi.
Oh.
Development has been with us for almost 60, 70 years now as a solution to the world poverty, justice, injustice, oppression, all sorts of things. One of the other terms that goes with dependence, with development is dependency. And now it's sustained development, but I think it turns out to be sustained dependency. And in some cases, it's being used as a humanitarian war. There are hot wars going on, but at the same time, there is humanitarian. And yesterday, I think it came up as well, that it's a form of war. If it is so, why are we continuing with this deceptive, you know, institutional solution to a problem that never comes about? And it only aggravates the problem. And I'd love to hear from you guys whether, also, of course, there's another term that goes with development, that's development corruption. So development dependency, sustained dependency in corruption. If those are realities of the outcome of this development effort, then what might be the solution, or if there is a solution?
Well, that's a great question. Let's see if it's a question for a panel, I think. It's a really important one. I'm going to speak in a concrete way on the issue of dependence, on a concrete issue that I think reflects many of these areas. What we are seeing, for instance, in many parts of South America, and I think that's true for Asia and Africa, is a continuing reliance on the primary economic sector, which means producing commodities in ways that maintains regions in conditions of development that they have been for 50, 60 years. Right? So yesterday afternoon, there was a discussion about value chains, value added, and transformations that really shift the economic models of regions, and we are not seeing that. You have both parallel developments of traditional commodity economy that continues to expand to regions like the Amazon and increasingly to Africa, that transfer very valuable resources with almost no aggregation. So you have this very high surplus for countries, but very poor results on the ground. And now you have a green commodity market that sort of follows the same way with carbon compensations or other climate change mitigations, that depend on those vastly sparsely populated regions, right? The rural areas that we talked about, and more or less perpetuate, so to speak, a commodity primary sector production. So I think in terms of dependence, one of the things that we haven't seen is that transition from primary economic sectors to a transition of high value-added sectors in which you then create the base for employment and the value aggregation that states and municipalities can take. Because in the Amazon, what you see today, you see a very interesting situation of one of the sources of commodities for the world, right? Where municipalities cannot aggregate value, they're all insolvents. So you have, it's a very paradoxical situation that I think maintains a long-term dependency situation on commodity production and transformation elsewhere. And that triggers to many other problems in rural areas, in urban areas, and so forth.
This gentleman who already has the microphone, go ahead.
My name is Christopher Sproats, and first I'd like to thank you for a thoroughly enjoyable panel. As for my question, previously over the course of this conference, there's been a discussion of the tradition of a sort of paternalistic approach to providing financial assistance, especially on the part of the United States. I believe especially starting in the 90s. During this panel, however, there was a discussion of the possibility and effectiveness of a ground-up approach. I was wondering, even though we have discussed over the course of this panel some of the issues with scaling up this ground-up approach, if any of you had any thoughts on how, especially American financial assistance, could be perhaps restructured or reframed to be more effective in this ground-up way of providing assistance. Thank you.
Yeah, great question. Well, the first thing that comes to my mind is that there's a huge network of lobbying that runs around American aid assistance. So you have, enormous companies that mobilize expertise and mobilize frames for development that really take the largest bite of USAID. So I've seen projects here that are worse here, because we're, as a source of expertise, projects that mobilize $120 million for issues of land tenure in Ethiopia or agricultural production elsewhere, right? Where the largest part of those assistance will stay with companies that mediate the agency and the experts and the population. So I think this restructuring, again, it starts at home. It starts of how the flow of assistance is organized in a way that it reaches more, the communities where you are and the experts that, can help to make that happen, and not the intermediates that control a significant part of that assistance.
I think just to add to that, I think there's a changing landscape now when we're looking at assistance, moving from assistance to partnership, because the resource flows from overseas development assistance have basically plateaued, and the growing space now is for more private sector investments and FDI to countries. And I think one of the areas that possibly could be a growth area is definitely exchange of technology and also trade. Because these are definitely critical areas that can facilitate countries to be able to take advantage of opportunities and create revenues that they can use to support their people. So definitely we need to move away from just looking at assistance as funding to different types of partnerships that can happen, whether it's partnering even local areas, partnering between countries, to exchanging technology and those sorts of partnerships. But definitely we're moving towards an environment where we want more private financial flows, which are sustainable over the long term because people are making money.
I think we're just about out of time, unfortunately, but I hope that we can maybe continue a little bit of the conversation informally over coffee, which we have now, I think, for about 15 minutes. Is that correct? All right. Thank you so much. Please join me in thanking our panelists.